Hello.
Hello, Sylvia. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
We just finished that show.
Good evening, everyone.
No, the class is turned on, but I have to drive in the car now. I'll get home. We'll be home in about 5 minutes.
Good evening. How are we?
He's right here.
Good evening, Rabbi. Baruch Hashem, good.
Okay, who do we have tonight? Let's see.
We just finished that show. I'm going home now. I'll return.
Rabbi? Rabbi?
I think he's there, Sylvia. I think there's some technical delay.
Yeah, were you there this afternoon?
Yeah, this is Shoshone. I was here earlier. I liked your question. It's a good question.
Thank you. What did I ask?
You
Yeah, I don't
asked
get it.
about the Parsha, Dvarim. You asked about the laws in Dvarim, Deuteronomy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the difference, God had spoken them. Why
Yeah.
was a difference?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rabbi, we don't hear you. We do not.
Yeah, your microphone is muted, Rabbi.
How do you know he's talking?
We don't, but his microphone is muted.
Oh.
On this Zoom, we have lots of other controls. Like there's a little chat window. The rabbi is
Can you hear
trying to
me?
communicate. Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Now we
Yes.
hear.
Yes?
And we see you too.
Okay. Good. So everyone can hear me okay?
I can.
Then I'm gonna share screen. Okay, share screen. Okay. Michael?
Yes, Rabbi.
Uh-oh.
We lost sound again.
1 second, please. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Well, I can.
Yes.
What?
Michael can.
Okay. Can everyone else?
Yes. Yes.
Good. Okay. So let us begin. Okay, let us begin now. So the book of Devarim has a lot of very interesting features. So to begin with, in structure, the rest of the Torah either is telling a story, it's either telling a story, or it's Hashem speaking to Moshe. But it does not, it's or it's Hashem speaking to Moshe. But what we don't have, Moshe speaking for himself, except a few things when the Torah tells us the story of something Moshe said, right? You know, he speaks to Korah, how upset he is, and so on. But it's told by the Shlishi HaMedaber, by the third person. God is writing in the third person. But Devarim is mostly about Moshe saying, hey, this is what I spoke to you, and this is what I said, and this is what you did. It's in Moshe's voice. And we looked at that a little bit earlier. And the basic premise is that Moshe gave over everything what he learned from God. And then Hashem said, you know, you did a good job giving it over. I want you to write it down as the fifth book of the Torah. That is, we covered this today. But one of the interesting things we see in Devarim is that where Moshe is speaking for himself, he begins explaining things in other words, in Devarim, many of the laws are explained in greater details than they were in the first four books. And we already talked today about some contradictions that exist in general in the Torah, not necessarily in Devarim. But then also Devarim talks about ideas. In other words, in the rest of the Torah, Hashem appears, Hashem says, do this, don't do that, remember this, don't forget that. But Devarim, because it's Moshe speaking, tells us a lot about God and the Jewish people. There is a lot more about about how we relate to God and what God is and what the purpose and nature of the Jewish people is. Because the Torah is speaking to the Jewish people. The Torah assumes you know who God is because God is speaking, the first four books. And the Torah assumes you know what you need to know about the Jewish people because it's talking directly to them. But the book of Devarim is Moshe speaking, and Moshe is also speaking, as he says, those who are here today and those who are not here today. Moshe is speaking to future generations. And Moshe is talking about his experience and our experience with God, with how we experience God, how we see God, how we see ourselves, and so on. So Devarim is and many people write this, that Devarim is a transition between the oral tradition and the written tradition. The written tradition, the oral tradition, because Devarim has some of the features of the exegesis and explanation of the Torah, not merely the actual do's and don'ts and events. It starts analyzing things and thinking about them and so on.
Rabbi,
Yes.
a thing that comes to my mind immediately is there is a contradiction altogether in having Moses speaking. Hasn't he always said that he cannot, he doesn't speak? He has a problem with speaking, gets Aaron to speak for him. And here we have him full bloom speaking.
Well, I mean, there are several things. One, he said it was hard for him to speak. Doesn't mean he didn't speak. And conceivably, he taught himself to speak more. But, other commentaries say Moses' difficulty in speaking is because he saw things on such a high level, it was hard for him to bring them down to, in ordinary words. But he had 40 years practice. So by the time we get to Devarim, yes, Moshe, most people have to develop themselves to think in a more abstract and more spiritual terms. Moshe spent 40 years learning how to bring things down more, and Devarim brings things down more. But this is, Moshe is someone who grows and changes. And in the beginning, he wasn't inclined to communicate in a very basic, elemental way. But 40 years later, he certainly knows how to do this.
Thank you.
Now, so for example, Hashem says, I took you out of Egypt, I've done all this for you, and nevertheless you treated me like this. But Hashem is matter of fact, I took you out of Egypt. Till when will you, why did you get up, why did you betray me by the spies? It's very straightforward. But look how Moshe talks about the story with the spies. So if you look at the page I'm sharing, verse 30. Verse 31, I'm sorry. How do you question God's ability to wage war for you? Uvamidbar, in the desert, Asherita, where you have seen, Ashenesach Hashem Elokecha, as Hashem your God has carried you. Kasher Yisa Ishis Beno, as a person carries his little child. B'chol Derek, the whole way you went, at Boachem, till you came to this place. And now you suddenly don't trust him. You see the difference? Hashem in Bamidbar says, I took them out of Egypt, and they still don't believe in me. Moshe speaks in much more human terms. Moshe says, listen, don't you understand that Hashem carried you like someone carries their little child with such love? How can you not trust him? So Moshe is really making that connection. Moshe is really allowing people to see what God does in terms that they can relate to. So Moshe is really bringing things down over here. And when Moshe says this verse, Moshe says, "Gam bi yasanei Hashem." God was angry with me because of you saying you won't enter the land. So Moshe sees the failure of the people as his own failure. And also the other thing Moshe provides information that's important for the people, that he feels is important for the people to know. But that in the Torah, where Hashem is just matter of fact giving us information, you don't have it. So for example, we just went through at the end of last week's Parsha, the 42 journeys of the Jewish people from Egypt to Israel, right? We went through all those journeys. But you know what's interesting? That there's an important detail Moshe tells us here. So we think of them wandering 40 years in the desert, every day another place. It's not the case. Because of those 42 journeys, a bunch of them were before the spies, and a bunch of them were right when they were entering the land. And they actually spent 19 years in one place. And he says this there. Verse 46. Vateshu b'Kadesh, you dwelled in Kadesh, Yomim Rabbim, many days. Yomim corresponding to the days that you dwelt where? Everywhere else. They were 19 years in Kadesh. 19 years they stayed in one place and didn't have to wander. So Moshe provides us with that information. Now, if we move on to chapter 2, so then he discusses their whole journey to Edom and their fight with Sichon and Og. So in the Torah, in the earlier part of the Torah, Hashem just tells Moshe, don't be afraid of Sichon and Og, you'll conquer them. And Hashem, and it says he sent messengers, but it didn't help. Here Moshe talks, so he sent messengers of peace. And so Moshe expands on how he sought peace, though it was to no avail. Here's to chapter 3, okay. Now, another interesting point that we see, that Moshe was annoyed with the tribe of Reuven and Gad and half of Manasseh for wanting the hill country and the pasture land. But here he doesn't say that he was upset with them. He just says, I gave to the Reuven, verse 16 here, I gave Gila to Reuven and Gad, and I gave them that place. And then I commanded you. In other words, Moshe is satisfied with their commitment to go before the Jewish people. And Moshe here doesn't mention that he was upset with them and he felt that they didn't make a wise choice. And so you see that Moshe here is not recording precisely what happened. He's demonstrating his feelings after the fact. So that's another thing that you see in Devarim, that Moshe discusses sort of the final disposition of things rather than development. The story of the development is in Bamid. Then you move on to the next parsha, which is Vet Chanan. And in Vet Chanan, hello, Bobby.
Hello.
Bobby, did we have a minion?
Yes, I
Baruch Hashem.
called Bob. You got exactly a million.
Beautiful. So then we come to Vet Chanan. And there, Moshe really talks theology. He really talks philosophy. And I'll give you an example of that. Chapter 3. So here Moshe talks about his feelings. I wanted to go to Israel. God doesn't let him. God doesn't accede to his request. And then, however, Moshe begins to talk as if it were the philosophy of Judaism, something you didn't see very much before. So, for example, look at this chapter. Ushamartem vasitem, keep the mitzvot, verse 6, because it is your wisdom and your understanding in the eyes of the nation, that they will hear and say, what a wise nation, this great nation. Who is so great that God is close to them whenever we call upon it? And who is so great with so righteous ordinances? In other words, Moshe here talks about the Torah as something which has a message to the whole world. And Moshe says, look, the Torah is written in justice and it's written in fairness, and its values and ideals are something that will influence the whole world. Moshe is talking about the Torah not as its giver, because that was the first 3 books, that was God. He's talking about the Torah as someone who received it and someone who was amazed by its beauty. It feels enthused by what it can teach the world. And then, again, something which is Sinai is mentioned matter-of-factly in the Torah, the first 4 books. But here Moshe says, verse 9, don't forget the day you stood before God in Horeb. Moshe is reminding us of the experience of standing at Sinai and is expressing its awesomeness. Again, this is the Torah speaking in the language of the people, of the recipient, of Moshe, rather than merely in God's language. So Devarim personalizes the Torah. Until now, we've been talking from the perspective of the giver. Now we're experiencing Torah from the perspective of the recipient. And that's entirely appropriate because Torah is a partnership, as we discussed earlier today. Then he goes into a long guard your lives exceedingly. You saw no form when God spoke to you, so you shall make no form. You shall make no idol, no statue even of God. And this gets actually very interesting because you notice the enormous emphasis. If you look all the way from verse 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, there's a long discussion. So we've talked in the past that idol worship was like very interesting to people. And it made sense. It's a God that was tangible, you could touch. And here, Hashem is saying, no, you have to worship one invisible God. It was a big deal in those days. So Moshe is emphasizing this. It's interesting that Maimonides says that a huge part of the Torah, many of the mitzvot are designed to wean us and push us away from idolatry. Many mitzvot relate to according to Maimonides, relate to the question of idolatry. And yes, this is the big question. Because the biggest problem with idolatry is that it militates against truth. Because in idolatry, you get to decide what your God looks like. You get to decide what your God asks of you. You create a God in your own image. And then you can make your God tell you whatever you want to and feel good and sleep well at night. Whereas the Torah, which is one God, and a God that is not definable in the human experience, there's no image, no form, tells you who you need to be. You don't get to decide who God is and what God tells you and how God treats you. You don't get to decide what is right or wrong. Only God does. Whereas in polytheism, in paganism, everyone gets to design a God that matches exactly what they feel like and what they want. And therefore, if we're going to have an objective truth, and we're going to have both between God and man, and man and fellow man, you're going to have true, proper behavior. It has to come from a source that you don't get to decide and you don't get to define. Whereas paganism is all about defining. Every idol matches the animals and the people of that place. Every idol you see looks like the people of that particular place. Because it's about creating a God. On one hand, there's a religious impulse. On the other hand, you want to use that impulse to match what you feel like, rather than challenge yourself to overcome what you feel like, to overcome your natural inclinations and become something else. Bereshit begins with God creating the world, therefore saying, look, I created the world. The world needs to deal with my agenda. Devarim ends with the idea that we experience God on one hand on God's terms, but on the other hand, we get to mold ourselves to those terms. And this is a very big theme. Does anyone have any comment or discussion, on this emphasis on idolatry and what it really teaches us? Anyone?
Well, Rabbi, if idolatry is so attractive, why would a person then do what's right and
Like all other attractive things. In other words, the attraction of all that is wrong is to our feelings, our desires, our fears, our emotional self. The part of the human experience closest to that godly spark within us, to the godly soul, is the mind. So in other words, it's a question of whether you let your knowledge of what is true and good govern your feelings and desires and actions, or vice versa. In other words, either the mind becomes a slave to make excuses for and make philosophies for and get you what you want based on your basic animal appetites, or you control yourself and you, in all the aspects of human life that are physical and that are natural, are guided and molded and controlled and constrained by a value system based on your knowledge of what's right. In idolatry, the heart mind is the slave of the heart. In Judaism, in Torah, not just Torah, but the idea as it exists for everyone, no laws, but in monotheism, the heart exists as the servant of the mind. The mind knows what's right and controls and checks and molds and adjusts. So the answer is idolatry is very attractive, but so are many other things. And our capacity to control ourselves and to delay or negate gratification and to overcome our fears and do what's right is what makes a human being a human being. We have the ability to undergo the difficulty of self-control, to undergo pain and challenge and so on for an idea. We are willing to give to suffer pain and to invest time and money and possessions and so on in a completely abstract idea. There are many forms of tzedakah that are of no benefit to you. The abstract idea that you have an obligation to others, even if you don't expect any recompense. That idea lets you give away stuff that you could actually use to give yourself life. The strong have power over the weak. The idea of rule of law, the idea that you don't take what you can, even if you feel you're strong enough and you don't have to be afraid of anyone else. That fundamental premise is an idea over the facts of life, over the physical facts and the emotional ideas. So the answer is that it's absolutely true that idolatry represents a belief system that allows you to assuage your need for religion and for meaning, while at the same time do whatever makes you feel good, often at the expense of others. But we have a soul that gives us the power to say no, to say, what is God telling me at Sinai? What is right? And we're able to give away real, tangible, physical benefit for the sake of an abstract idea, because the abstract idea is right. That's the essence of being human. And that comes from an invisible, abstract, but very real God. A God who created everything but cannot be defined and not be seen, and has absolute standards independent of what feels good to you and works for you. That's the essence of the whole thing. And this essence is very developed in the book of Torah.
Rabbi?
Yes.
The episode that we see with the golden calf is a model for this kind of behavior and this kind of need that people will fulfill by creating their own god, their own idol.
I
say it's the model. This I think we hear about it, and as part of the lesson?
Yeah, no,
What is
I
God?
I think that's entirely right. That's why the golden calf is such a terrible sin, but also such a good model. Because and it says, right, because it says they built this calf that they arose to rejoice, and the Gemara says rejoicing is immorality, rejoicing is murder. The purpose of having a golden calf is so you can, because people, there's this whole argument now, because it's very clear that people's brains are wired for religion. So some people say, oh, religion is an accident of evolution. And I say, and others say, no, God created our brains in such a way that we're capable of experiencing religious ideas. But once our brains are wired for religion, so what happens is that we co-opt that sometimes for a bad purpose. And that's the whole paganism thing. Every ism, communism, Nazism, any ism that involves bad and horrible behavior to other people, or between you and God, or usually a combination thereof, is a function of the need to fulfill that space, that need for religion, that need for truth. But I sometimes fill it with idols, with falsehood, because that assuages my conscience and enables me to continue to do whatever I want. The flip side is I have this need for truth, so I seek the truth, and I'm willing to sacrifice my comfort and my aggrandizement for the sake of that truth. One is monotheism, one is paganism. And we see this further, a little bit further in Vetchana, where Moshe starts talking about, really very deep philosophy. So here in verse 39, V'yadata yom, know today, V'ashavota elavavecha, take to your heart, Ki Hashem hu Elokim, that Hashem is the God, is the power, in the heavens above and in the earth below, Ein Od, there's none else. Now, that doesn't mean there are no other gods. It says there is none else. Many other places says there's no other gods. In other words, that here Moshe is challenging us to recognize that everything in the world is a projection of God's power and being. That there is there's nothing else, means to say that everything in the world is godliness. Everything in the world is God expressing himself as that thing. There is nothing outside God. There is no, and therefore, hence, all the mitzvot. Because every aspect of life is simply an expression of God's being, and therefore God can be found everywhere and in everything. Sometimes by rejecting something, that's the negative commandments. Sometimes by embracing something, like we use the physical world for the positive commandments. But this idea that God is not just present and all powerful, but permeates and is the stuff of everything, is a very, very deep and profound idea that's articulated here explicitly. And it drives all of Jewish thought, the philosophical, the mystical, and so on. This one sentence is the most profound single statement ever said in history. And Moshe here lays it out on the table and tells it to us openly. It's in the written Torah. I mean, this verse is the essence of everything we believe. And it's the essence of the logic of the entire Torah. And we don't find this in the first 4 books. We find
where are the Jewish? Where is Israel at this point when they hear this, or
they're on the plains of Moab. They're on the banks of the Jordan, facing Jericho.
So they're ready to enter the land.
They're ready to enter the land, but they don't enter till Moses dies. And I'll show you one more thing because we have a little bit shorter class tonight. I'll show you one more interesting thing that happens. I mean, of course, we have the Shema in Vet Hanan. The Shema deserves its own treatment that I will give it. When we get there in a week's time. But there's something else. I want to go much further into Devarim. We'll look at each parsha on its own.
You might be interested in knowing this. This is the first time I'm going through this book in
Yeah.
this fashion, right? Because most courses were stopping for the summer, so you didn't get to read or to study these.
It's the opposite. I feel in the summer, people have more time. And now we're Zooming wherever I am. We can do it, right? Okay, yeah. And Devarim is very, very important because, Moshe is part of the Jewish people. Devarim is sort of the Jewish people's response to God. The first 4 books is Hashem talking about everything else and so on. I'm looking something.
This whole book, God doesn't speak to Moshe. Moshe speaks to
Only
God.
at the end, at the very end.
Very end.
Right, this is all Moshe, and then God tells Moshe, hey, you did a good job. Write this down. But here, verse 9 is really the beginning of a new parsha. Look how Moshe speaks. Atam netzavim hayom kolchem, you are standing before God, Rasheichem, the head of your tribes, and so on. And he goes to the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. And you're entering a covenant with Hashem and so on. So that God may establish you as a people. You see, you're entering into covenant. A covenant is a treaty between 2 parts. You lift yourselves up, then God will set you up as a people. It's no longer passive. Moshe says, hey, you're partners with God now. It's up to you. It's not just stuff God does to you. You have to do things for yourselves. And you have to find God on your own. And you're entering the land, and you'll have to, till the soil and fight the battles and so on. One of the things that happens in the book of Devarim is that, yes, it's Moshe's voice, very good, Joe. And it's the Jewish people's voice. And we're being empowered.
Oh, Rabbi, you're on mute now.
Probably knows.
Hello, everyone. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I have to conclude here, and we will pick up, God willing, next week. Thank you all for coming.
That's
Thank you, Rabbi.
this style very much resembles Har Sinai.
Which style? Oh, you mean what Moshe's doing? Yes. But the point is, it's a whole book, and Moshe's empowering us. Yes. Okay. Very good. Take care, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah. Have a good night, all.
Drive carefully. Rabbi.